Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Crime Country. As always, I am your host, Nick Barksdale, and today we are joined by a phenomenal guest, and that is Dr. Michael Aamodt, the creator and the mind behind the serial killer database at Radford University. And so, without further ado, Dr. Aamodt, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Oh, happy to do it.
When it comes to serial murders, in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, we saw hundreds of serial killings, to the extent that some experts, such as famous true crime author Dr. Peter Vronsky, actually labeled this period the epidemic years. And so I have to ask, after seeing such a brutal increase of murder, has serial murder actually declined? And if so, why?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So in terms of, again, known serial killers, it peaked in the 1980s. And you started to see really kind of an increase in the 60s and 70s. But before we talk about kind of the decline, the one thing you have to keep in mind is that that term serial killer was coined or became popular really in the mid-70s. So if you're doing a search to try to find serial killers from, let's say, the 1940s or the 1920s, using the term serial killer isn't going to find those folks. So what you have to do is use terms such as convicted of 2 murders, convicted of 3 murders, and you have to meticulously go through and try to find other terms that the media might use to find those folks. So I think that probably the numbers of serial killers, prior to, let's say, the 1970s is probably much greater than we think. It's just difficult to get those. But again, if we stick with what we know, it seems to have peaked in the 80s and has declined each decade since then. And there's all sorts of speculation about why there was the decline. But to me, I think the key differences really are, or the key reasons are, first, the change in parole. In the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it was much easier to get parole if you committed a felony than it is since then. And what we found is that of all of the serial killers in our database, at least the U.S. ones, 18% had committed murder, went to prison for murder, were released, and then killed again. And so just by having the longer paroles, or the longer prison sentences and less parole, I think that's a big reason for that reduction. Now, with that said, very few murderers who get paroled kill again. So you have, even though 18% of our serial killers had done that, it's actually a very small percent. So I'm not trying to advocate that we never parole murderers, and because especially when they get paroled, they tend to be older, and when you're older, you just don't have the energy to go out and commit murder. So I just want to kind of clarify that. But so the parole changes, I think, is a big difference. Second reason is it's really more difficult to find victims today than it was in the 1970s and 80s. And I remember growing up as a kid, for example, I rode my bike by myself everywhere. We walked to the store, we hitchhiked, we did all those kinds of things that people just don't do anymore. And with cell phones, for example, if your car breaks down in the middle of nowhere, you take your cell phone and you call for help. Back then, you had to rely on strangers coming by and helping you out. And there's a good number of serial killers that was their method of finding victims, was looking for disabled motorists. So the fact that the kids are not walking to the store, they're not riding their bikes, they're not doing those things, I think it's just been much more difficult for serial killers to find victims. And if you're a serial killer who's out there looking for somebody, you still may find them. But so much of the murders that are in our database are really opportunistic. Person was driving by, there was a child that was walking to school. They weren't necessarily out looking for somebody, but they found that victim. Kind of a third reason for the decline is probably technology, and that's really reduced certain types of serial killers. So, for example, you don't see black widows, and for those that are listening that aren't familiar with black widows, those are people who will kill a spouse or a relative in order to get money, get their insurance. And if you go back again into the 1800s and the early 1900s, you could kill a spouse, move to a different state, get remarried, get an insurance policy, kill that spouse, move somewhere else, and probably nobody's going to know that you're doing it. But today, with technology, right? As soon every insurance company knows about all the claims paid by other insurance companies, and so if all of a sudden you start having multiple spouses that pass away, it's going to be something that's going to be noticed. Same thing with serial killers who kill patients in a hospital or a nursing home. The technology in hospitals now is that they track deaths. They know the expected death rate for different types of diseases, and they know who was working with each patient at each time. So those patterns are, due to the technology, are easier to detect earlier. And so I think those are kind of the three key things. I think we have better law enforcement methods than we had before. So it may be that we catch somebody after the first murder instead of their killing others. Or it could just be that, Dr. Phil has made the world a better place to live.
I think we'll go with that one.
I think that's the one. Yep.
I think that's definitely it. I have a question. When it comes to the decline of serial murder, me and my brother were having a discussion on how so many of these serial killers, if you read their autobiographies or biographies, they're exposed to a certain type of, you could almost say, pornographic images as children. And usually it's the old mystery covers. Usually a woman is in distress and there's an aggressive male, so on and so forth. There were these really bad, like paperbacks of like the 50s and early 60s. And usually most of them would say they would latch on to that kind of pornography that they were exposed to as children. And they would just keep going and keep going and keep going until eventually, that didn't satisfy them anymore. And me and my brother had posed this question to each other. Do you think because of modern pornography, like especially easily accessed on the web, with every type that you can imagine out there for the most part being legal, do you think that has a role in maybe satisfying people with those desires?
That's a good question. And I haven't seen any evidence that that's the case. But there's a forensic psychologist, the late James Turner, who was just a phenomenal practitioner and just a really interesting person. He did a presentation one time at a conference where he was going to predict not so much that the number of serial killings was going to increase, because it didn't. But what he said was the killings that did occur were going to be more horrific for kind of the reasons you were talking about. And his thought was, it's all going to be about virtual reality. So, you start with that 2 pages out of your Playboy that somebody first maybe starts with pornography, and then that doesn't become enough. So then perhaps you start to watch pornographic videos, and then that's not enough. And his thought was that with virtual reality, that it was going to just so ramp up that kind of that game in terms of the type of pornography that people could be exposed to, that he thought that the only place to go from there is these more horrific crimes. And there's no evidence that that's the case, but I thought that his paper was just really interesting. And it got me thinking, and it's something that when I was teaching, I always brought up in class and had the students comment on that. And they thought the same thing I did, just like, wow, I hope that's not true.
And just to clarify to whoever's listening to this, I'm not trying to say that serial murder is linked to pornography. And so if you watch pornography or you look at pornography, that automatically makes you a type. For my audience today, I just wanted to clarify that I'm referencing the more violent aspect to pornography. I just felt the need to clarify. I wouldn't want anybody to be offended and think that I'm trying to, make pornography into something else completely. So that's my disclaimer there. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all so much for joining me on Crime Country as we went over the serial killer database, statistics, and so much more involving the true crime subjects that we are all fascinated and oftentimes terrified by. To all of my subscribers, don't forget to check out the links in the video description below. It'll take you to the database, serial killer statistics, and all of the awesome work that Dr. Aamodt is doing. Dr. Aamodt, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.